Good afternoon and welcome to the Professional Body of Sports Leadership Wellness session. Thanks very much for joining our first live event. For those of you that are new to the PBSL, we've established a new body in sports that is designed to look after the welfare and professional development of professionals working in the industry, something that we've never had before and we think we need. Our twin objectives are to provide the professional development of people working in the industry and those that aspire to, but also the individual support, things like legal advice, career guidance, and a key point for that will be our wellbeing program. And delighted that I'm joined today by two people that are absolutely key to that program. Firstly, Rachel Fellows. Rachel is a wellbeing consultant and founder of the Yoke Consultancy. Good evening, Rachel.
Hello, nice to see you, everyone.
And Ian Braid. Ian Braid will be well known to some of you that are familiar with the sports industry. Ian has been a chief executive of the British Athletes Commission in the past and a non-exec director of the British Triathlon Federation. Ian, good evening.
Good evening to you, Tom. Rachel, hi. Good evening, everybody.
Rachel, let me start by asking you to give us a bit more about your background. I've given a very potted history, but please tell us a bit more about yourself and what you bring to the wellness agenda.
Yeah, thanks, Tom. And it is a real privilege to be here, and I appreciate, especially at this time, it's witching hour in many people's houses. So thank you for creating the space to come and have a conversation and to hear Ian, Tom and I share a few things. My background is actually in management consulting, whatever that means. And often we've been asked to deliver projects of change and data systems process change. And the culture bit was often the afterthought. And it led me to become very interested in the idea of well-being. I think we'll come on to what on earth that means. But as a result, I did a master's in business and well-being and then set up Yoke. And we're effectively now trying to help people who want to really embed well-being into their organisation. And that might sound straightforward, but there isn't actually a standard way of doing that. So I think it's very much experimental and figuring it out. And we're working in the sports sector as well to help understand what that will look like for the future.
And Ian, a bit more about yourself, please.
Well, clearly I can go a lot further back than Rachel, but I won't. I probably start because it's important to why we're here now and why I'm here now. In my career as CEO of the British Athletes Commission, I was very much looking after offering advice, support and guidance to 1,500 Olympic and Paralympic athletes. And during that time, I had the privilege to take a phone call from Baroness Tanya Gray-Thompson, who asked me to help her in her review of duty of care in sport for Tracy Crouch, the then sports minister. Many people on this call, everybody on this call probably knows about the investigations into the culture of many high performance sports post Rio. And I was involved in a lot of that. And without going over in too much detail, not only was the athlete's mental health affected, so was mine. And I spoke to many CEOs and PDs and coaches when I went back to work briefly. And I, despite being a man of a certain age from the north of England, told them about my mental illness. And I was amazed at the response that I got, which was universal. I know exactly how you feel. I know 5 people like you. I'm on 6 pints a night, etc., etc. And I thought, who's looking after the people? Looking after the people. And and out of my illness, that became my revised sense of purpose. So set up Docia Sport. I found out afterwards Docia is from the Latin meaning good reputation, so there's no bad thing there. And I've gone on in that piece of work and been recognised only this year, slightly anticlimactically. I was awarded the Mental Health Consultancy of the Year award. And in pre-COVID times, you would go to some glitzy event and have a table for 10 and blah, blah, blah. My award turned up in the post.
Well, nonetheless, still very well deserved it. You raise an interesting point there about well-being in sport, and it wasn't until you started the conversation that other people admitted that they also had experienced difficulties, and that's something that I found during my career. Do you think we have an issue as executives, non-executives in the sports industry, that we don't talk about it enough? Because if you look at athletes, professional players, there seems to be a lot more openness since the days of Marcus Trescothick being one of the first high-profile professional athletes or players to admit that he had issues. And since then, there's been quite a few that have come out and a great deal of support. But as executives in the industry, do you think there's enough awareness of it and enough support there?
I think we probably don't know what we don't know. I hope that through going to conferences, etc., and the narrative changing, I think it probably is better than it was. There's still a lot more to be done. I know of chief executive networks in which the well-being of peers is discussed. So I think it's probably getting a lot better. How much so? Why would I know? But I still think there's a lot more to be done. And it's, the role of a CEO anyway is a very lonely job. So even when you're firing on full cylinders, you're in the sandwich between your board and your exec. And so it is important that everybody has somebody to turn to.
And Rachel, coming to you, the subject of well-being, wellness is very broad. What does the term mean to you? How would you define it?
Yeah, and I think this bit links to what Ian was just sharing, and I was sort of writing down in my notes saying, what is it, and do we have the skills to know where we're at if we do understand what it is? But maybe I just start by adding an academic definition, because fundamentally resilience, mental health and well-being and wellness are all different things, and we tend to use them in the same vein. So well-being is comprised of two things. The first is what we'd call academically as eudaimonic drivers, or effectively how satisfied we are with our life. And satisfaction comes from that long-term view of, am I heading roughly in the direction if I can look beyond today? The second part of that we call hedonic drivers, which is hedonistic. So it's the happiness drivers. Quite literally, do I have my morning cuddle with Fred, the dog, Ian, or do I have a cup of coffee or whatever it is? But it's the hormonal exchange or response we have to our life. And we often like to talk about things like oxytocin and stuff like that. But it's a literal experience of happiness in our day. And when we start to balance satisfaction and happiness, we are considering well-being. And well-being is even more interesting because it's not saying we have to have both at the same time. It's saying having awareness of both. So there might be times in your life you choose to be satisfied, but you're unhappy, but you can see that as an end in sight for a purpose to move towards a happier place. So it's that balance, and mental health is part of that, but it's only one part. And I think picking up on Ian's point is, I think we're getting better at talking about the mental health side, but there's so much more to it that drives our satisfaction and our happiness. So I'll pause there, but hopefully that's a useful starter.
And Ian, anything to add from your perspective? How would you define wellness and well-being?
Well, as you know, I'm not an academic, Tom, so I'll give you a more sort of from the ground definition from my own point of view. But I have become a mental health first aid instructor. And I mention that because in mental health first aid, you talk about a stress container. And so in a well-being context, I think it's very important that you manage your life in such a way that the stress container doesn't overflow. And you can lose focus. I lost a lot of focus. I became useless as a chief exec, a father, a husband, and a son. And that was because my stress container overflowed.
And tell us a bit more about that.
So that's one aspect I think I'd add to Rachel's point. What do you mean?
So, sorry, and tell us a bit more about how you came to the realization that you were really struggling.
Well, my decline into that mental health pit took place over, I think back, and it was an 18-month period, and the decline was incremental. So therefore, you lose sight of what is normal, because today is normal. And also, for me, and it's a personal journey, but for me, I put all this armory around me, which I hear, but I don't listen, as Mrs. Braid would say. But I mean that genuinely. She was concerned and I wasn't listening. And it was only, and I think one of these things, this is very important as well, is that you surround yourself with good people who have lots of patience. And in my case, after 18 months, it was my son, Harry. And he said to me one day, "Dad, you think you're working too hard. Right time, right place, right person." And A, he shocked me. And B, when I thought about the answer and gave it to him, which was, "Harry, I don't know how to relax anymore," that frightened me too. And the second thing that happened in consecutive weekends was, after a after a 3-year campaign by the aforementioned Mrs. Braid about can we have a dog, as Rachel's mentioned, this dog Fred turned up in our house as a 12-week-old soft-coated Irish Wheaten Terrier. And our house, first dog ever, our house was joyous, giddy, chaotic, and I have never felt so lonely in my own house. And I left it. And it was those shock tactics almost. It was like an electric shock, wake up, Ian. I went out for a bike ride and I came back and I said to my family, "I'm going to the doctors tomorrow. I think I'm poorly. And I also think I'm done at the BAC." So they were big, it was, metaphorically car crash moments that made me wake up.
Rachel, obviously you've dealt with wellbeing for a number of years now as part of the Yoke consultancy, and we've listened to Ian there. How would you advise people to recognise the telltale signs that Ian's articulated and the first steps to tackling them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting question, and I think there's a couple of things I want to touch on. First is, Ian sort of described in his 18-month journey, most people who struggle with burnout or get to a point where they feel like they're having a car crash moment, it's rarely trauma driven. It's rarely one huge thing. And this is where it's a really subtle skill that we need to develop, but it's a drip, drip, drip over time, slowly depleting your well-being. And then suddenly the one email or the one train that's late is the thing that drives you over the edge, or it's your comment from your son, Ian. And I think as a society, we are not listening to ourselves in the ways that we could. And there tends to be, if we look at, I was describing the academic, but roughly speaking as a human being, for example, do we have practices whereby we listen to what our mind is telling us? We listen to what our emotions are telling us. We listen to what our physiology is telling us. And usually, especially if we're working in head office jobs, we over-rely on our mind because we are sedentary. And it's easier for us to ignore an emotion or a pain in our shoulder. But actually, these are all signs that we need to start paying attention to. And there are many, whether it be the mental health first aider or different courses, but ultimately they are trying to highlight that really we need to lean into listening more, in particular in times of stress.
Obviously, it's been a strange time and a very difficult time over the past few months with the pandemic, and there's been a lot of pressure come on the sports industry in terms of dropped revenue, organisations restructuring and so on. How can we alleviate some of those pressures during an unusual situation like this? Yeah. Rachel, let me come to you first.
Yeah, and I think I sort of, Ian, and I know you'll pick up on it from a different angle, but I think carrying on the sentiment of where I started about leaning into our well-being. So as human beings, we tend to do things that are good for us when we're feeling well, and we tend to forget about them when we're feeling a melting point of stress. And I think at a first point, we need to start retraining our brains that that's okay. We need to start saying when we're feeling stressed, that is our signal to do more for ourselves, not step away from it. And there's a couple of things going on for me. There's almost, we think about it as 3 buckets. There's me, myself, and I, the personal bucket. There's then us as a team. So on this call, for example, the Ian, the Tom, the me, how are we going to talk about this? And then there's the organizational piece. And I'll lightly touch on all 3, but as an individual, you don't suddenly become resilient. You practice resilience during moments in your life. And actually, what we're going through now, and bear with me on this, but we are being given a really amazing time to develop our resilience. We've had lockdown 1, and that was a shock, and I appreciate that. But this mini lockdown, we can really understand what's going on for ourselves if we choose to do so. There's 3 weeks left. It feels like a manageable amount of time. So why not let's give it a go, doing more of the things that are good for us? And maybe we'll come on to the team and the organizational side shortly, but this really is a time where we can reflect on how we want to design the way that we work and live going forward. And we shouldn't feel that the government are telling us what to do. We should feel that we can step into redesigning based on our well-being.
Ian, what are your thoughts in terms of lockdown? How does lockdown 2 differ from lockdown 1, and what sort of coping mechanisms would you advise?
Well, this is different, and I agree wholeheartedly with Rachel about that. This, hopefully, touch wood, it is a 4-week time period, and it doesn't go on exponentially. I think there's an important thing about self-awareness, which this, as Rachel says, I agree. I think it gives us an opportunity to get off whatever roundabout we were on and have a really old good think about that, and take the lockdown 1 roundabout and get off that and have a really good think about that too. So things that I am making a point of doing in this one, because it is different to the first, is for a kickoff, I am being kinder to myself and giving myself more breaks. It is not big and clever to do 8 hours worth of Zoom calls, for instance. So I am doing less Zoom calls. I am, call me old-fashioned, but I am resorting to phone calls. Remember those? And doing those. And also, one other thing is restructuring my day, because this lockdown is different to the last one because it was light this time. In the first lockdown, it is now dark. So I'm reorganizing my day and such that having a longer break during daylight hours and wherever possible, getting outside. And also trying to be kind to me as well. I have sort of given myself a self-appointed sacred hour, right? And I am absolutely untouchable in that sacred hour. And I can, do nothing, but things will happen in a do nothing time because your mind's going. The aforementioned Fred, who sadly can't be with us this evening, but he and I walk first thing every morning. It is that sacred hour. It is also an anchor point for my day. So I am trying to be kinder to myself this time round than I was in the last one, and hopefully being of more benefit to other people.
I certainly think that's a common theme, and a lot of people watching this evening will look at their diaries and they'll see back-to-back calls, and because more people are working from home and not in the office environment, there's no travel element, there's no differentiation between one meeting running into the next. Do you think that's an issue? Do you think we need to be a bit smarter about how we plan our days?
Hugely. I have an adult daughter who in first lockdown was living on the Seven Sisters Road, And she suddenly realised she could spend the lockdown in Sussex as opposed to in Finsbury Park, right? So she came over the weekend and stayed. And Jess is a senior executive in Roche and was working behind me. And I could listen to Jess every day, and she'd say 2 minutes to the hour and a minute to half past. Right, well, thanks very much, everybody. I know you've got another meeting to go to now. It was great talking to you. Bye now. Hi, everybody. And she would come off her last call at 5, 6 o'clock, and she'd say, right, that's me done. I'm absolutely battered, and I've got nothing done today. And I think, her employer, which happens to be Ross Farmer, they have a duty of care to their staff and be learning as well and encouraging. And I think some organisations are. I do some work with UK Coaching. They have a ban on Zoom meetings between 12 and 2, for instance. So you can't do back-to-backs. We have to learn, and we have to take ownership of it as well. I had back-to-back Zoom meetings this morning, 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, and I said to the 10 o'clock guys, when he said, right, well, we've got till 11, I said, we haven't. Because I'm finishing at 1:45, because I'm just going to make a cup of tea, have a stretch, do whatever. We've got to break that, less is more, I think, is a way forward, which maybe Rachel hopefully agrees with.
Yeah, right. Rachel, you work across multiple sectors, different areas of industry, finance, law. What can the sports industry learn from those other sectors?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. And I appreciate as well, there's a sentiment of fear still in many sectors. Sorry, I was just listening to someone's radio then, I think. So there's a sentiment of fear, and that is, for many people, a motivation to be busy or to look busy, because what if I'm at risk of redundancy next? And actually, there's something slightly contradictory about that, because as Ian's just shared, it's not smart and it's not effective. So if you want to stand out in this time, it's about being a role model in this space. But that feels quite bold and uncomfortable. But the enlightened organisations, maybe outside of sport, that are doing good things about this are investing now in how do I upskill? How do I encourage or instill rules around our ways of working? Creating contract around what's good for us now, because we've never been here before. And even lockdown 2 is very different from lockdown 1. Most organisations have found that all the disciplines that work for people pre-lockdown have been thrown out the window, and they are working in the worst possible way they probably ever have done. So as a result, there needs to be a remotivation on this agenda. And I think the balance that Ian said about, how much do we be the patronising parent as an organisation, and how much do we want to empower our people to take this up themselves? We have to acknowledge that we're all knackered. And sometimes it's really nice to be told, this is what we're going to trial, even if it's for lockdown. Then let's have a chat about it at the end and say, is it working for us? Should we carry on? Should we change it? But I think the sentiment of almost appropriate boundaries to start to sort of step into is a really great one.
One of the areas that we've touched on is the potential threat to people's livelihoods, to their jobs, people who've either been made redundant or they're going through processes at the moment as the sports industry is hit very hard by the pandemic. What can we offer in terms of advice to anybody going through that process? Because obviously it's a devastating time. Rachel, perhaps you can start on that one.
Yeah, and I was made redundant, actually, it's probably about 12 years ago, and I could honestly say I still don't really know why. And I think that's the really interesting process, and maybe it's bigger stuff, or maybe it's a personal thing, but all I can remember about that time was feeling immense shame and confusion. And I would say that we need to acknowledge that that's how it feels like, whatever is the reason for why you happen to be in that redundancy space now. And if I knew what I knew now, then I would say there has to be a process of you creating space to emotionally regulate what's just happened. And whether that be journaling, chatting to friends, meditating, but being okay that that is a really painful experience. And it might come out as anger, it might come out as other things, but only by going there will you then be able to bounce forward and feel in a really great place to get fit for your next chapter. Because all the good things, whether that be the vaccine or the spiking growth, apparently 15.5% in the last week, we're having good news now. So it feels like we are beginning to step back towards what we would hopefully deem to be normal, but making sure that we're fit to get there comes from acknowledging how uncomfortable it actually is to start with.
Having been made redundant myself as well, Rachel, and at a time when I had a very young family and you've got bills to pay, I absolutely recognise what you were saying about those feelings of shame, embarrassment, and that sheer terror. Ian, have you got any pearls of wisdom that you can offer people tuning in about how they can refocus after that initial shock?
Well, I think there's a big comparison with performance sport, isn't there? In that most athletes don't choose when their sporting career ends, and that has been their sense of identity, their sense of purpose over many years. And there are, and I'm sure Rachel knows better than I do, I'm sure she does, about this, there is a sort of a curve of the emotional stages that you go through. And I think it's probably worth, recognizing that that is a proven route to recovery. And in it, it is okay not to be okay. And that is part of it. And I think, again, you have to be kind to yourself. And I think you make the big decisions when you are in, when your stress container is not overflowing and it's got some capacity. And also, I don't think, I took voluntary redundancy a few years ago, but I've also worked where I've had to make people. Well, I've made jobs redundant, not people. It's not. That's an important thing to stress as well, isn't it? And I remember doing that at the Raw Sun Alliance, and I closed a 200-seat call centre down, and they were told it was going to be made redundant. They were going to be made redundant, and the closure was in 6 months' time. And then they appointed me as the call centre manager. No, thanks very much for that. But I got all these guys, let's get the wagons in a circle. And when you walk out of here in 6 months' time, remember, one, you have done nothing wrong. And two, you are going out there in the best shape of your lives as you can be, because you have got value to somebody. And that's what we did. And a lot of people got work. So be kind, be patient, give yourself some time as well, I think would be something I'd encourage people. Don't do it on your own. Sorry, I'm getting pointy now, aren't I? Don't do it on your own, right? Yeah. One of the things I'd learned from I said earlier, it's very lonely being a CEO. It's even lonelier when you're a CEO suffering from general anxiety disorder and depression and you're burnt out, right? Very isolating. It feels it. You could be in a crowd of 80,000 people and never felt so lonely in your life, right? So I have recruited a personal board, and that personal board knows me ins and outs. They know who I am, what's important to me, so on and so forth, and they know when to check in. And I would encourage everybody, again, remembering they've done nothing wrong, if they haven't got a personal board, to get one and go through the journey with other people.
I'd absolutely agree with that, Ian. From my own personal experience, the one thing I didn't do soon enough was talk to people. And I think you have to reach out to those trusted people in your life, and it could be your partner, family, friends, colleagues in your network. If you haven't got that individual, then you need to find it pretty quickly, and that's hopefully something the PBSL can offer through our mentoring program as well. But the key thing is to reach out and have those conversations as early as possible, because that starts the process of getting past that initial shock, I think.
Yeah. Have hope. Have hope.
Ian, you touched on another point there about being on the other side of the equation, where you've had to make people redundant. And again, I've been in a similar position, and it can be really tough for the person that has to carry out that process, but also the colleagues left behind in an organisation where they see friends they've worked with for a number of years walk out the door. How does that affect them, and what can they do?
Well, I think there's probably two key things. One is sometimes, I think, from on the experiences, shared experiences I know about, one is a sense of guilt in that, you know, colleagues have gone and I'm still here, and that has to be talked through. There's also, I guess, some fear about, well, when's the next round? And if there is a next round, then, you know, you've got to be prepared, you know, start being prepared now, you know. It's easier to hit a return serve if you're already moving than if you stood still, to use a sporting analogy. And the third thing to be careful of, and I would worry in many organisations, not just in the sports sector, is there's been a 25% cut in the workforce, but there's still 100% of the workload still to be done. So there's a lot of take and give care to employees that have remained as well, I think.
Rachel, anything to add on that point?
Yeah, and I'm always really interested in that. It's like, you know, let's take people out of a team and let's expect actually you to deliver more. And there's an interesting question that sits behind that, because we can either assume that we need to carry on doing things the way that we've always done them and just suck it up and see, and hopefully keep under the radar and we're safe. Okay. Or we are bolder and have that team conversation and challenge ourselves that we need to think about this differently. And there are organizations doing that at the moment. So for example, if you're sort of feeling like you are one of the ones left behind, you're still working and still active in a team that feels more like a sort of a bone of skeletons now, I would say instigate the conversation and say, do you know what? Simply to get through this, exactly what Ian says, let's talk about how we're all feeling, because we need to flush that out. And some of our clients like, which is not necessarily a helpful analogy, but it's that process releases pressure. It is quite simply letting some of the hot air out so that we can then focus on what next. And then it might be as simple as going through a ruthless prioritization exercise. You know, what are we actually going to expend our energy on out of choice? And how can we challenge ourselves to do it in a far more active, agile, maybe even experimental way? Because we're all feeling or all being asked to do more with less. And we can't assume that the way we've always done it is the right way, therefore.
Excellent, thanks, Rachel. Hopefully there seems to be some brighter news on the horizon with regards to the pandemic, with potential vaccine on the way. And that's something we all hope for. And hopefully the sports industry will get something like some semblance of normality back before long, and we can get crowds into sporting fixtures, and we'll get back on our feet sooner rather than later. But in the meantime, are there any practical exercises that people can do that can help safeguard their well-being and give them some coping mechanisms? Ian, you first, please.
Well, one of the things that I have been poor at, that I am encouraging myself to do, is, you know, if you're in lockdown and therefore can't move around very much, then you've got to move around in different ways, or certainly move your mind around in different ways. Thinking about what was coming, I was reflecting on I have a elderly mother. Of course, she's an elderly mother because I'm an elderly man, right? But she's up in Cumbria, and she's safe and she's well, and she sends her best regards, obviously. But a huge, adds large dollops to my stress container, worried about my mum, so far away from Sussex in Brampton in Cumbria. And I caught the train, all socially distanced, everything's all fine, but it was a really harrowing trip because I had to wait for my mum to be brought to the door of the place where she lives, and then I had to leave her at the door and go back in, and that was really quite sad. And so I was sat on the train feeling very sorry for myself, and then my stress container was close to overflowing anyway, and I'm now sat on a Avanti West train with loads of other people piling on, some wearing masks, some wearing them wrongly, etc., etc. And I could just feel this, So I got my book out, and that was, it's a small thing to do, but immerse yourself, take yourself somewhere else and immerse yourself in this case, a good book. And it was called Beneath the Scarlet Sky, if anybody's interested. It is a hell of a bloody read. It's a novel, hell of a read. But 4 hours on the train from Carlisle to Euston flew by. I'd also say one other thing maybe, which I've noticed, that difference between lockdown 1 and lockdown 2 in Shea Braid is that in lockdown 1, our house under the project manager, Mrs. Braid, was like changing rooms meets ground force meets the repair shop, right? It was just a complete thing. But it's now Des Res, and I have been allocated a workspace, which is in the dining room. And what I make sure that I do every day is I put everything away at the end of the day so that my, quotes, virtual office becomes the dining room in our house again. And these are small micro movements, right? But they're helping my well-being. People joke about this too, but I have 4 changes of costume during a day as well. I have my dog walking, that's my sacred hour outfit, right? My dog walking outfit. I wear work outfit. I change into doing exercise, which ideally most times I do outside. And then I change into my, not that you'd like to see it, but my relaxation gear, etc., etc. But again, I'm telling my head, this is that part of the day, and it's all in the same confined space, but it's helping me be better the next day, and the stress container isn't filling.
Yeah, I think that demarcation between the various elements of your life is absolutely critical. I know I've got that wrong, and I keep revisiting it because there's times when you are answering your emails because your laptop's on your lap and you're not going to and from an office. So I think that's great advice, Ian. Rachel, anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I was just thinking about Mrs. Braid's washing. You must have a lot of washing.
You are being stereotypical, Rachel, in assuming that Mrs. Braid does all the washing.
You should have said what my husband and I had an argument about this morning. It was exactly that. But anyway, there's a couple of things for me. One is a personal thing. So I know that, Tom, Ian, I had a baby on the day of lockdown 1. So that was an interesting experience. And I think observing people's reactions, and I can't see faces on the call, but normally it's like, oh shit, poor you. And yes, I did give birth on my own, but actually what practice I've learned is gratitude, because there are so many beautiful things that came out of giving birth or working in lockdown. But for me, I had no obligation to see anyone for the first 3 months of having my first child. I ended up living with my parents. I ended up being able to have afternoon naps. I ended up not worrying about work because our work world pretty much paused. So I would say, I know that's a personal story, but there is a lot of good if we really look at well-being in a holistic way, whether that be our relationships with our family, our fitness levels, or whatever it is. There's a lot of good that has come out of this. So I think spending some time to redesign the stories in our head about it, because the sentiment broadly, whether that be through the media or the way we accidentally pass each other on a pavement and say, are you all right? We need to kind of say, yes, we're okay. And this is what we've learned from it. And I don't mean that in a naive, positive psychology way. I just mean, let's acknowledge what good has come out of it. And the second one, I think I'd sort of maybe is a bit more of a practical exercise. And it's partly because my life is very much shifted this year. But one thing I do observe from the sporting world is there is a desire to be more diverse, but at the moment we're definitely not there yet. And if we kind of then place that into, well, what can I learn through that? It's really seeking in this time how different people, and I mean really different people, have experienced this year. It's about spending time speaking with, for example, Olivia, my little daughter's next door. You might be able to hear her screaming, having her tea, but she now has a babysitter who I'd never met before. And her whole life is different. And she's a foster carer as well as looks after Olivia. And I'm learning more than I ever thought from her about resilience and lockdown and families and becoming a mum and trying to work and all of that stuff. So there's a sort of exercise, and we call it constellations. But if you draw yourself in the middle, or if you're on your table, you put yourself as a salt and pepper pot in the middle. And then you kind of go, gosh, who's my nearest jam pot? Who's my nearest Marmite? And actually, you start to place out who in your life has got an influence on you. And actually, are they facing you or are they facing away? And then just have an honest conversation about how diverse that is. And if it's not as diverse as it could be, start to play around and orientate yourself in a different way, because I think the cognitive diversity angle is a really interesting one. And the more people I know have a breadth of or an openness to responding to lockdown in a different way, they are bouncing back quicker.
Excellent.
If I could just make a point, if I may, because you mentioned the word grateful or gratitude, Rachel, and I think that is again for me something that I came to appreciate very forcefully because of lockdown. I know I have a lot to be grateful for. And therefore, I also felt that I had a sense of responsibility with that, because it is very easy to see people very close to us who are in a far worse position than us as a result of COVID. There is a quote which I bored Tom and Rachel with the other day, which I will read to you if I may, which says, "We are not all in the same boat, but we are in the same storm. Some of us are on super yachts and some have just one oar." And that's it. And I think, again, one of the things that we can do that helps us is find some way to be kind to somebody else who is in a less fortunate position than us. For me, I set up a food bank in my village in Sussex, and it has continued through the summer, and of course it's still going now. And the fact that people are benefiting through my facilitation of other people's generosity is also something else that's helping me. So, finding reasons to consciously be grateful for things and acknowledge that is, I think, a very powerful thing to try to do.
Rachel, before we ask the viewers on the podcast for any questions, and we've got some questions that have already been emailed in, if you do have any questions, please use the chat function or just put on your camera and give us a wave. But Rachel, in the meantime, before we go to the first question, can you tell us a little bit more about the resources you and the PBSL have put together for people who might want to look a bit deeper at this?
Of course. So I think after some initial discussions and actually having worked with some sports companies last year, we realised that there is a little bit of a gap in terms of people's awareness about what well-being actually is. Where am I at on that journey, and how do I start to do something about it for my life in a meaningful way? Because there is a sentiment, we are in sport, therefore we do more exercise, we become physically fit. And that again is only a tiny slice of what it really means to live a whole well life. So on the PBSL package, the wellbeing side of it, there's a couple of things. The first is a survey, a diagnostic tool to help you figure out where you are, which I think is really, really interesting. And the second is then it takes you through a few little things to guide you, now you know where you are. The first thing, which has been a thoroughly enjoyable experience, is a series of conversations with people from across different sports and saying, you know, where am I now and what have I learned about my own resilience, well-being, mental health? And that is really that first step. We're trying to inspire people to step into the vulnerable space of talking, listening, talking, getting that sort of self-regulation bit going. And then the other parts, which is the videos as a guide, and there's also some active coaching sessions, that's then trying to convert that listening bit and that empathy bit into action in a strategic way. So there is some content there to sort of say, this is actually what we have found to be most effective. And also, please come and join us in a coaching conversation if you're not sure that what you are doing is working for you, and we can begin to kind of develop those ideas for you a little bit further.
Excellent, thanks Rachel. So if you are looking to engage a bit further, please have a look at the PBSL website, pbsl.com. All the wellbeing stuff is on there, but also there's details about the career guidance that we're offering, about the personality profiling for a bit of self-awareness, and also crucially our coaching and mentoring network that we're establishing, which will offer one-to-one support to people in the sports industry. First questions come in to both of you, Rachel and Ian. How can heads of department or managers safeguard the well-being of their teams when everybody's working remotely? Any thoughts on that?
Do you want me to go first, Ian, or do you want to take this one?
Ladies first, Rachel, please.
Of course. So do you remember when the first week of lockdown happened and everyone was saying, do you know what, how are you? How are you? I think we've got a little bit used to saying it, and we now don't have time for it. So it's, yeah, hi Ian, how are you? Yeah, but actually what I really wanted to talk to you about is this. And I think there's a sentiment that we need to revisit that process. And a couple of ways that we can do that. And I'm just sort of looking at my notes because I was reflecting on a coaching conversation I had actually this morning. One is, if we know that through a Zoom conversation or whatever it is, it's harder for people to feel connected, it's our responsibility as a leader to step into being vulnerable. And it might feel like oversharing, but Brené Brown is really awesome on this stuff, but she talks about the empathetic desert. And in a way, good sharing should feel like a tumbleweed moment, because you're usually the first one to have stepped into that space. So I think being vulnerable is really interesting, because then you're carving out new space for it. And then reciprocating by genuinely creating space for a response, not moving on, asking questions really curiously in a different way. So not the how are you, but meandering and trying to draw different things out from people. And then also when we notice people are doing different things, such as Ian's golden hour, do I as a leader actually say, that's really awesome, Ian. I'm really, really glad you're doing that. And actually, can I do it with you? We rarely comment. And then when we don't, we're sort of accidentally not giving other people permission to do the same thing. So I think there's a process of being vulnerable, asking things in a different way, and then really validating the good decisions that people are making at the moment.
Ian, anything to add?
I wholly agree about showing an individual's human side. That piece about vulnerability. Also reflect on, that quote I've just said about we're all in different boats in the same storm. Then, understanding there's not one size fits all in any dialogue or conversation. You've got to understand where the individual is. Are they in a mansion or are they in a flat share with 12 other people 30 floors up, right? I think this is an opportunity to move cultures a little bit. I always remember, and I can't remember most of these things, but the 1 Minute Manager, which was a management tome back in the day. But there's always one thing that I've always remembered from that book that sticks with me, and I think is even more important now, and that is remember to catch people doing something well. And I think when people are working remotely, to be acknowledged and recognized, I think will go a very long way. And I would do it differently. I would not say to Rachel Fellows at hotmail.com, saw what you did today, well done. Why not write them a card, send them a letter, do something else, right? Just go that one little bit step further. And I think it'll go a long way for that sense of unity that you still want to build. I know for sure that some of the organisations I've been involved with and are involved in, I've heard exec teams say, we know more about each other now and feel more cohesive as a team now, working remotely, than we did, this much praised water cooler moment time when you were physically in the office together. Mm-hmm. There's lots of positives in this.
I've heard exactly.
Yeah, sorry, Rachel, carry on.
I was just saying, I've heard exactly the same, and actually, it's as simple as you can see people's lives happening in the background. You can hear what's going on, and you can more fully, rather than just see the professional face, you see the whole of them. And I think there's a lot of positives again that have come out of it. And actually, that's what my clients are saying. And I think this might come on to your next sort of point around what do we then take from that in terms of how we can design working from home or working from an office or whatever that is. But there's really interesting lessons in that.
Yeah, we've been working with a consultancy at PBSL to put together some resources, and they'll be available from next week. But I think one of the key takeaways that I've had from the process is about when people are working remotely and there isn't that physical interaction of engaging in conversation, is active listening. And that's something I think we all forget sometimes. I think we hear the words, but we don't hear what somebody is actually saying. So investing that time and investing your attention in people is absolutely paramount in situations like this.
Can I just add one more tiny thing? Sorry, but I don't know if you can kind of reflect on the days that you've had and how many times you've been on a Zoom call and you can fully see that someone else is typing. I find it one of the most disrespectful things. And if you genuinely want to go through the act of listening, like, listen, be on that Zoom call, honor that Zoom call. And I think that we're not very disciplined on the whole about really being there with people.
I think also I agree with you, and I've been in calls where you've seen a gallery. They have only taken submitted questions. They've not allowed interaction, and notwithstanding this evening's event, all of the cameras are off. And I've been in the gallery as a participant, and I know that there's been 3 levels of conversation going. The one you're supposed to be paying attention to, the questions in the chat that's being ignored, and the WhatsApp messages between all of the delegates who are, saying, and I think of one particular event I went to, and it was a catastrophic mistake and a huge opportunity missed, because it was about how to address the Black Lives Matter element in the sports sector. So I think there's a duty on the host, no pressure here, Tom, there's a duty on the host to make sure that the rules of engagement are set up right as well. So that, people, it isn't tick box compliance. Yes, I was at that meeting. Well, no, you weren't, because physically and mentally you weren't there. So, set the rules of the meeting up properly and ask people to adhere to them.
Okay, we've had a question sent in from Hayley. If you're on this conversation and you feel like something is off in some way, where would you start? Rachel, let's go to you first.
If you're having a conversation, you feel like something's off.
Well, I think the sentiment is, if you're not feeling right in yourself and you're listening to this, where can somebody go to start the process of recognising that and dealing with it?
Yeah, I think there's either end of that conversation. So if you're noticing someone else, or if you're noticing it in yourself, give yourself permission to stop and say, I need a break. Because it's absolutely coming back to Ian's point, is there's actually no point in you being there. That is the classic case of presenteeism. You are not actually being productive. The most productive thing to do is to say, excuse me, do you mind if we reconvene in 10 minutes or whatever it is? But I think really, or have a yawn like that person. Thanks, Sue. I think really giving yourself permission, and it sounds trite and trivial, but it's hard to do.
Ian, we've got a question that's come in for you. You mentioned duty of care for people in regards to the wellness of individuals. How do executives incorporate wellness in their duty of care for employees in a practical setting?
Well, I mean, I think there's there's no one answer. I think, you know, it depends on the culture and the setup of the organisations you're in and so on and so forth. I think the critical thing is to have a collective decision as opposed to a sort of a top-down decision. And I remember when I was at when I was the CEO of the BAC, and there was somebody who was having a lot of difficulty that I was dealing with, and somebody else said to him, you can't steer a parked car, i.e. just get going, just start to do things, and other things will fall into place. I think COVID and lockdowns give us a great excuse, in a way, to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and build, even if it's don't turn your microphone on mute when you're having a yawn, for example. Yes, apologies accepted, Sue. But just, you know, to be serious, I think consult with staff particularly, and ask what they've learned from their colleagues about other organisations, and just have a go. And it's okay to make mistakes, and okay to learn. This is a unique time, and we should take advantage of that.
Rachel, one final question for you before we start to wrap up. How do organisations strike the balance between well-being and striving to reach business targets and ensure business priorities are delivered? So where's the value for a CEO in investing in the well-being process, I think?
So there's a couple of things with me there. A is the word striving. Should we be striving? Is that the smartest way to get there? And I would say no. And B, well-being is a performance agenda. I think there's something really interesting if we don't understand this, because we can see there's a business case, but we still put it over there. But if we're honest about, if we want to sustain the way that we deliver great things, we have to have a team that's resilient, able to respond to change, able to deliver each event and recover from it and bounce back and deliver the next one, able to talk and collaborate so that we can innovate each year on year. So I think that they are not, it's not an either or, but I think the striving language often takes you down a different road to a performance and well-being direction. And I think that's where the sector is at the moment, and where hopefully through the work that we're doing, we start to orientate it towards a possibility of, again, using Ian's languages, if we try it, we know that we're a high performing world, but if we try a high performing and a high well-being world, what might that look like?
Yeah, Rachel, I agree entirely. As somebody who's been a CEO of national governing bodies and clubs myself, I think well-being was very low down on my priorities of where I'd look to invest, because everybody's trying to maximise the use of finite resources, particularly in an environment now. But I think things are changing, and the more that I've learned about the wellbeing agenda, the modern executive, the modern leader within the sports industry needs to be very much value driven and live those values and invest in their people. And I would urge anybody in that position to really have a look at their culture and their values, invest in the people around them. But also as individuals, I think we can invest in ourselves as well, and take a bit of care of ourselves. So we'll wrap it up there. Ian, Rachel, thank you very much for joining us. We'll do this again. We'll have another wellness session, and we'll probably sometime in December we'll circulate details. We've got some more sessions coming up with the PBSL. Next Tuesday, the 17th at 5:30, we've got a high performance forum, and we'll be joined by Dave Redding, who was formerly performance director at the Rugby Football Union. He's worked with the BOA at London 2012 and with the FA as Gareth Southgate's right-hand man. And also we've got Mo Bobat, who's performance director at the England Wales Cricket Board. They'll be discussing all things high performance, about cultures, how we can improve the well-being of athletes, and how we can get more out of high performance cultures. And then on Thursday, the 26th of November at 4:30 p.m, we've got our Diversity, Equality and Inclusion session with Rishi Jain, who heads up DE&I at Manchester United and who's been doing some groundbreaking work there, and Lazeli Satali from DAZN Broadcasters. So please join us then. In the meantime, if you have any questions or would like a conversation about the PBSL, feel free to send us an email at info@pbsl.com or check out the website. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we look forward to seeing you again soon.